Hey there, and welcome to the training, The Asylum Interview Demystified. I'm Brian Manning, and it's an honor to support you in your asylum journey. In this training, I'm going to show you exactly what to expect at your asylum interview. Now, why did I give this training the title, The Asylum Interview Demystified? Well, you see, it's because the asylum interview is, in fact, a mysterious thing. People don't really know much about it. Yes, you may have heard bits and pieces from a friend or relative who's gone through it, or you may have gotten a bit of information through social media or through a WhatsApp group or whatever, but I really think it's important for you to get the whole picture. It's important that you know exactly what to expect at your interview. Now, why is that? Why is it important for you to know exactly what you're getting into? Well, as human beings, when we're uncertain about something important, it causes stress. And studies show that when someone is stressed, they don't function well. They have trouble concentrating. They get nervous and they can't think well. The reptilian brain kind of takes over and you lose focus. Now, I saw this all the time when I was an asylum officer with the government. Many of the applicants I interviewed were stressed out to the point that they had trouble communicating effectively. No kidding. The stress that's exacerbated by uncertainty causes asylum applicants to slip up. They may get a date or other important fact wrong or completely forget something that could be the key to their case. But I found that just knowing what to expect at the interview goes a long way toward helping people feel better. The sense of familiarity surrounding what's going to happen that day and understanding why it's happening will put you at ease. When you know what to expect, you'll feel almost like you've been there before, like it's not really so foreign to you. You'll be calmer and you'll be more confident. And this will help you to tell your story in a way that shows the officer that you deserve asylum. So what we're doing with this training, along with the other trainings I provide that cover the substantive aspects of getting asylum, is removing that uncertainty. I'm so happy to tell you that you're going to head into your interview knowing what to expect and ready to face it with confidence. Okay, so what happens on the day of your asylum interview? Well, I view it as 5 phases. There are 5 different phases or steps you can expect on the interview day. Step 1 is the check-in. Step 2 consists of administrative tasks at the beginning of the interview. Next, at step 3, you'll answer the substantive questions. And this is where the officer is digging deep into your qualifications for asylum. Next up, for step 4, you'll be asked what are called the bar questions. Basically, are you a terrorist or have you committed any crimes? Asked a bunch of different ways. Lastly, at step 5, we've got the decision instructions, where you'll learn how you're going to get your decision and what happens next in your case. So that's the overview, but we need to look much closer at each of these phases so that you'll know what's going to happen. We're going to start with your arrival at the building where your interview is to be held. Note that this may be a standalone building housing only the asylum office, like the Los Angeles Asylum Office, or the asylum office may be located within a larger building, which is what we see here with the Chicago Asylum Office, which is way up high in a skyscraper. You need to scout out ahead of time and know exactly where to go. Now, I say a lot more about these logistical steps in my training titled Your Game Plan, Concrete Actions You Must Take to Prepare for Your Interview. In any event, once you get to the entrance of the asylum office, you'll be ready for step 1 of the 5 phases on interview day, which is the check-in. When you get to the asylum office, you'll first have to go through security, which means passing through a metal detector. Right when you walk in, you'll be greeted by security guards. At some asylum offices, they ask to see the letter that says you have the interview that day before they let you proceed, so you should keep it handy. If they don't ask for it at this stage, you'll definitely need to show it after you pass through security when you're actually checking in, which we'll discuss in a minute. Since you'll definitely need it early on in the day, I recommend keeping the physical copy of the appointment notice, which you'll need to print out if you don't have the hard copy that came in the mail, someplace where you can access it easily, like in a binder you carry in your hand. Folded up in your pocket is fine too. Not a problem if it gets creased or wrinkled. The security guards will notify you that you're entering a facility operated by the federal government and that it's illegal to take guns or any other kinds of weapons into this space. Note that this prohibition applies even if you have a license from the state in which you live to carry a gun. It doesn't matter. You still cannot take it into the asylum office. Don't take any kind of sharp objects with you on the day of your interview. Do you carry a pocket knife or perhaps carry mace with you for protection? Leave those things at home. You don't want the stress on the day of your interview of having to explain this to the security guard, or worse still, forgetting about these things and having the security guard discover them on you. That would be bad. The security guard will ask you whether you have any weapons with you. After you answer, they will ask you to remove any metal items from your person or anything else that could trigger a metal detector, including your car keys and your cell phone. They will ask you to put these items in a tray, which they will pass through a scanner, and they will direct you to walk through the metal detector. Basically, it's similar to the process of going through security at the airport. A word on communication. If you have a hard time communicating in English and you're not bringing an interpreter with you to the interview, like if you're not very fluent in English, but the appointment notice said USCIS would provide an interpreter for your language at your interview, then it could be a little difficult trying to engage with the security guards. There's a decent chance they'll speak at least some Spanish, but you can't count on other languages. You may, accordingly, want to consider having a friend or family member who speaks English accompany you up to security. They can help you with this interaction and then just leave. Okay, so at this point, you've made it through the metal detector. What happens now? Well, next, you'll likely go to a check-in window that will likely be in a waiting room where you will show them the letter you received that says you have an appointment, along with your identification. It's possible, though, that you won't be able to proceed directly to a check-in window. At some asylum offices, the security guard gives you a little number, and you go and sit in the waiting room and wait for them to show your number on a sign or perhaps say it out loud over the speakers. If this is the setup where you are, you'll have to wait until your number is called before proceeding to the window. Pay attention to the sign or announcement. It may tell you to go to a specific check-in window if there are multiple such windows. Make sure you go to the right one. If you have family members included in your case, meaning you have a spouse or children who are dependents in your application and thus required to go to the interview, they'll need to go with you up to the check-in window. At the check-in window, you'll be met by a clerk. As mentioned, the first thing they'll do is ask for your appointment notice and for your identification. They usually ask for all forms of identification that you and your family members have with you. You and your family members should take with you and be ready to produce your current passport, any expired passports that you have, and any other forms of ID like a driver's license, company identification card, social security card, or school identification card. What about items like this that are from your home country and not issued in the United States? Should you provide them when asked for ID? Well, yes, you should, even if they're not in English. You do not need to have them translated for purposes of the interview. When you submit an item with your application materials or as part of a supplemental filing with the intention that it serve as evidence in your case, then yes, that needs to be translated. But don't worry about getting an identification item translated if it's just being used for purposes of providing ID while checking in at your interview. The clerk will take your identification documents and have copies made. They may step away from the window and do it right away and then return the original to you before you step away from the window. Alternatively, they may give them to someone else who will make the copies and then return the originals to you later, either at the beginning of your interview or at the very end right before you leave the office. Note that sometimes they do forget to give people their original identity documents back. So if you get to the end of your interview and the asylum officer or another staff member is ready to walk you out of the interview area and back into the waiting room so that you can exit the building, but you still haven't gotten your originals back, be sure to ask them to please return your identity documents. So we said that in addition to giving the clerk your identity documents, you're going to give them your interview notice paper, right? They're going to put a stamp on it that confirms that you showed up for your interview, and then they're going to give it back to you. You should keep that. In fact, I recommend taking a photo of it as soon as you go back and sit down in the waiting room after checking in, so that you'll have proof in digital format of attending your interview. It's unlikely you'll ever need this, but it's best to have it just in case. At the check-in window, the clerk will also ask you whether you have any additional documents that you want the asylum officer to review for your case, which you haven't previously submitted. Now, I strongly encourage you to submit everything you want the officer to see well in advance of your interview. This is because if you try to dump a whole bunch of things on them on the day of the interview, not only will you annoy them, believe me, I know from personal experience that it's stressful for the officer when this happens, but you also risk having them reschedule your interview. I've seen this happen. When an applicant submits voluminous documentation on the day of the interview, the asylum officer can say, okay, this is too much for me to adequately review today. I need time to examine all this, so we're going to have to reschedule your interview. So try not to bring new evidence on the day of your interview. Sometimes that can't be avoided, and that's okay. You may get a threatening text message, for example, the day before your interview, and you would definitely want to print that out and take it with you to the interview. Speaking of taking evidence with you to your interview, how should you handle that? Well, I say more about what to take with you to your interview in the training I referenced earlier called Your Game Plan, Concrete Actions You Must Take to Prepare for Your Interview. But for purposes of the present training, let me just say that you need to bring any original documents with you, meaning the underlying original version of a document that you submitted a copy of to the asylum office. Then you need to have those neatly organized and easily accessible in case the officer asks to see them during the interview. You don't want to waste time and frustrate the officer because you're fumbling around trying to find the right document. And let me take this opportunity to state, as I often do, that evidence, while sometimes helpful, is not nearly as important as you're probably thinking it is. It's a myth that you need a bunch of evidence to win at the asylum office. You can win asylum without a single piece of documentary evidence as long as your testimony is detailed, consistent, and plausible. And I discuss this issue in much more detail in my CHIPS Framework for Asylum Success training. Be sure to check that out if you haven't yet. If the officer asks for a specific piece of evidence, like, for example, do you still have that threatening letter that the bad guy sent to you? And if so, can I see it? That you do not have, well, you need to be ready to explain why you couldn't get it, or at least why you no longer have it. As long as you have a good explanation for this, one that makes sense and is true, then you'll be okay. Not having this piece of evidence won't be a problem. Okay, let's go back to the check-in process. When we left off, we were still at the check-in window, and the clerk had asked to see our identity documents and our appointment notice, and they've asked whether we have any additional evidence to submit. Well, what else happens at check-in? What's next? They will take your photo, and they'll also take fingerprints. They'll do this for any family members included in your case, too. This is done to ensure that the person standing before them, who will go into the interview room, is indeed the same person who submitted the asylum application and who showed up at the biometrics appointment. They're matching the photo and fingerprints against the prior records they have for you. They won't take you to a special photo booth or anything. They'll just have your family members move to the side so that they're not in the photo, and they'll hold up either a digital camera or a webcam and snap a photo of you. The fingerprints are taken electronically, meaning you don't have to worry about getting ink on your fingers in the old-fashioned way that this is still sometimes done. It's similar to the process you underwent previously at your biometrics processing appointment, except that you probably will not have to have each finger fingerprinted. Instead, they'll likely just ask you to place on the little scanner your index finger from each hand. And with that, the clerk will ask you to have a seat in the waiting area and will tell you how they're going to let you know that it's time to go back to the interview room with the asylum officer. They may call you by the last 3 digits of your alien number or immigration number, which will be on your interview notification letter, or they may also address you by your name, either your full name or just your last name. You should try to memorize the last 3 digits of your A number, as your immigration number is sometimes called, in case that's what they use to call you. You may also consider writing it down on a piece of paper and keeping that handy, like by putting it in your pocket, or ensuring that you keep your receipt notice, which has your A number on it, and having that available. You do need to be paying attention while you wait, ensuring that you're listening when someone calls out a name or an A number. Sometimes it can be noisy in the waiting room, making it a bit difficult to hear. All right, so you've taken a seat and you're waiting. Well, what is that like? Well, there's a pretty good chance you'll be in a very crowded, noisy room. It's not ideal, not super comfortable. And what makes it really tough is that you might be waiting quite a while. In fact, you could wait hours. This is a really frustrating aspect of the asylum offices. They do a lousy job of making the experience of the customer, i.e. you, the asylum applicant, pleasant. In my experience, they're not too concerned about the fact that you may be waiting for hours to be called for your interview, perhaps trying to care for children while doing this, making it even more difficult. Now, why do these delays happen? Well, there can be any number of reasons. The officer might have had an interview before yours that ran long, or they might have just received your case file that morning and need time to review it and do the required security checks before the interview starts. Cases are normally assigned to officers about 2 weeks before the interview date, with the idea being that they'll have plenty of time to do all the necessary preparation work before interview day. But things happen. Officers may call in sick, have to travel for work, quit the job entirely, or whatever. There can be many reasons why an assigned officer can't end up doing their interview. So then it gets dropped in someone else's lap. There can be other reasons for delays, technical issues like problems with the software the officer has to use, or things like electricity failures or a busted water pipe. This stuff seems to happen more often than you would expect. The bottom line is that you may have to wait hours for your interview. The good news is that it doesn't mean there's a problem with your case or anything like that. But what should you do while waiting? Well, some people like to study their application materials, especially their personal statement or declaration, which is the written statement in which they explained their case. And that's fine if you want to do that, but I personally prefer not to crash study on the day of the exam. For me, it causes stress. I like to study hard the day before, but then take it easy on the morning of the big day. You can consider taking a book with you to read or anything else that'll help you pass the time. It's fine to just mess around on your phone. You are allowed to take it with you, but you must silence it. You don't want it ringing or making any other noise during your asylum interview. I therefore recommend silencing it before you even get to the asylum office. You don't want to take the chance of possibly forgetting to do it while in the waiting room. If you use your phone or another device, do not put on earphones or use earbuds. You need to be able to hear what's going on around you, as someone will eventually be calling you for your interview. I recommend taking some food and water with you to the interview. You may want it while waiting to be called to the interview room or during a break after the interview actually starts. I recommend taking food that's hassle-free and won't cause a mess. Something like a few granola bars or Kind bars. Ensure that any drink that you take has a screw-on lid. Bottled water will be fine. The security guards likely will not let you through with a cup with a lid on it, like a coffee or a fountain drink soda. The waiting room area will not have food or drinks for purchase. There will be a water fountain and restrooms for use. A word on children. It can be a real pain if you have to wait a long time in the waiting room with young kids. Definitely bring something to keep them entertained. Bring books or, if they're old enough for electronics, a phone or tablet with some preloaded games or videos. But note that if you're going to give them a device, make sure to have them use headphones, or at least ensure that the volume is turned off. It's really annoying for everyone around you in the waiting room if there's audio blaring from your kid's device. The same goes for the actual interview. If your children are in the interview room with you the whole time, like if you don't have someone else who can watch them while you're doing the interview, then you really don't want them on their devices making noise. That's very distracting for the asylum officer and will only put them in a bad mood and detract from what you're trying to accomplish. All right, so what happens next? Well, as I said earlier, eventually, either the officer assigned to your case or a member of the support staff will come into the waiting room and call you by your name or the last 3 digits of your A number. And you'll raise your hand or otherwise get the person's attention. They're supposed to introduce themselves, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just say something like, "Come with me." Don't let this curtness rattle you. If you have family members who are dependents in your asylum claim, they may or may not be asked to go with you at this point. I'll say more on their role in the interview later in this training when we discuss the so-called bar questions. The officer or support staff member will lead you through a locked door back into the area where the interview offices are located. You'll walk through the hall until you reach the designated office. There, you'll be asked to take a seat in front of a desk in a chair that probably won't be terribly comfortable. What do these offices look like? Well, just imagine a bland, stale room with very little in it beyond a desk, chairs, a phone on the desk, and computer monitors, and that's pretty much it. In the past, it was common for asylum officers to have their own office in which only they worked. So they would often actually decorate it with some art and maybe bring some other things to make it feel personal and comfortable. But now it's much more common for an office to be used by multiple officers, such that no one really feels like it's their office, and they therefore don't take any ownership over it and don't spruce it up. That's why the office you'll do your interview in is likely to be bare. At most, beyond the desk, chairs, and computer, there may be shelves with some files on them and perhaps an American flag. Not exactly a warm, inviting environment, unfortunately. All right, so you're on one side of the desk and the officer will be seated on the other side, facing their computer monitor. They'll likely have double monitors, which will take up most of the desk space. They'll hopefully have them arranged in a way that still allows them to easily make eye contact with you while they're doing the interview. If you've brought an interpreter with you, the interpreter will be on your side of the desk, seated next to you. Same for your lawyer if you have one. But note that sometimes the officer asks the lawyer to sit behind the applicant, that's you, or maybe even kind of back in a corner. It's sort of a power move by the officer, trying to set the tone and establish dominance over the lawyer, as if to say, "Hey, I'm in charge here. Know your role, lawyer." Also, they don't want the lawyer making gestures to you during the interview as if to try to influence what you say, perhaps by making a show of disapproval at what you're saying, by grimacing, or maybe making a subtle head nod. But some officers let the lawyer sit wherever they want. Quick note, this setup with you and the officer in the same room sitting across from each other with a desk between you may change if there's a public health emergency going on and social distancing protocols are in place. In that case, you and the officer will likely be in separate rooms, and you'll conduct the interview by video conference using a tablet that's on the desk in front of you. Now, this can actually happen, a virtual interview where the officer is not in the room with you and it's done by video conference, even outside of the public health emergency context. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if USCIS increasingly starts using this format, or if it one day becomes the norm. They've been testing this some, having officers work from home and doing the interview through video conference with you sitting in the asylum office using a tablet or computer to see and communicate with the officer. So don't be surprised if a support staff member walks you to the interview room where you're confronted not by a person, but rather find a room with only a tablet in it. If you're doing the interview virtually, meaning through video conference, and you're using interpretation that's provided by USCIS, the interpreter may be included through the video conference, or they may instead be connected by telephone. If it's by telephone, then you can expect the audio on the tablet to be turned off, and everything in terms of the audio will go through the speakerphone on the phone that's on the table. You'll hear the officer and the interpreter through the speakerphone, and they'll hear you through it. Remember, the interview notice that you receive will tell you whether you need to bring your own interpreter or whether USCIS will supply one for you. Now, traditionally, anyone wanting to use a language other than English had to bring their own interpreter. But during the COVID pandemic, this changed because USCIS was trying to limit the number of people coming into its offices. They started providing interpreters for many languages, including those most commonly used by asylum seekers. I wouldn't be surprised if USCIS began permanently providing interpreters, or at least for the most commonly used languages. The interpreters that USCIS uses are generally, but not always, pretty good. They're contractors who work for one of a select few large companies that provide interpretation services to private businesses and to the government. And in my experience as an asylum officer, these government-provided interpreters tended to be better than the interpreters that applicants usually bring. This is mainly because applicants usually don't bring professional interpreters. Instead, due to cost concerns or because they just don't know better, they usually bring some friend or family member who speaks their own language and also speaks English, or at least to some degree. Interpretation at an interview is really hard. If you're going to use an interpreter and you have to bring your own, I urge you to use a professional interpreter who has experience interpreting at the asylum office. If you're going to use interpretation and your appointment notice letter says that you are responsible for bringing an interpreter, then there'll be an additional person involved in your asylum interview, someone called a monitor. This is another interpreter contracted by the government who listens in on the interview to ensure that the interpretation goes okay. Basically, the government doesn't trust that you'll bring an interpreter who will do a good job and who will do an objective job. There's concern that they'll try to help you out. So the monitor will be connected by phone or by video conference and will just be listening, and they'll jump in if they think there's been a poor rendering of what's being said. They're basically there to correct any mistakes in the interpretation. Okay. When you and the officer are both seated and ready to begin the actual interview, they'll introduce themselves, usually by saying, "I'm Officer so-and-so," with the so-and-so part being their last name. Or if they're less formal, they'll give you their first name, which is what I did when I was an asylum officer. The officer will likely do some small talk, some chit-chat to break the ice. They may ask, for example, "How long did it take you to drive in this morning? How was the traffic?" Or they may chat with you about the weather, how you're adjusting to life in the United States if you've been here a short time, or any other benign topic that is meant to establish rapport and put you at ease. But some officers are all business. They might not do any small talk and instead jump right into the task at hand, the stuff they're required to do to decide your case. At this point, you've completed the check-in and getting settled phase, and the interview itself is beginning. We're at what I consider to be step 2 of 5 in the interview day process. Step 2 centers around what are largely administrative tasks. It's the stuff leading up to the substantive questions about your case. It may feel less important than the substantive questions portion of the interview, but I assure you what happens here and how you handle it can affect the outcome in your case. By way of overview, in step 2, the officer is going to give you an overview of the day's activities and give you some instructions. Then you're going to take an oath, and then the officer will review your asylum application with you. Then they'll ask you to sign the application. Now, that last part, signing the application, can actually occur right before the substantive questions begin, or it may occur after them, near the very end of your time with the officer. The timing of it is left up to the officer. I think the best way to give a sense for what this is like is for me to just give you the talk that I gave to applicants when I was an asylum officer. In this example, the applicant is using interpretation, but it's almost the same talk for those who do the interview in English. So here's how it went. Welcome to the asylum office. My name is Brian, and I'm an asylum officer. The purpose of our time together today is for me to better understand why you're afraid to go back to your country so that I can make a fair, informed decision on your asylum application. And in order for me to get all the information I need, we're going to do a few different things today. First, we're going to handle some administrative tasks. This includes me giving you information and a few instructions for our time together. I'll ask you to sign a couple forms, and then we'll review your asylum application, making any corrections or updates that may be required to ensure that it's up to date and 100% accurate. And that's the first phase of the interview. The second phase is me asking you a bunch of questions about why you left your country and why you're afraid to go back. I ask that you please listen carefully to my questions and try to answer the exact question being asked. Know that I'll give you a chance near the end of the interview to tell me anything you want me to know about your case that we haven't already discussed. And in the last part of the interview, after the substantive questions and answers, I'll explain to you what happens after your interview, including how you'll get your decision. Now, it's extremely important that we communicate effectively today. If at any point you don't understand something I'm saying to you or asking you, please let me know. I'll be happy to repeat it or restate it so that you can understand. If you don't know the answer to a question that I ask you, just tell me you don't know. This is really important. Don't just guess or make something up or tell me what you think I want to hear. I promise there's no penalty for saying I don't know or I don't remember. As you can imagine, it's really important that you tell the truth. Not being honest can lead to negative consequences. It can be a reason for us to deny your asylum claim, and it can also lead to monetary fines or even imprisonment. So I need you to be 100% honest, open, and forthcoming with me. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to make a promise to tell the truth and to sign a form saying the same thing. I want you to know that everything you say today will be kept confidential. Nothing you say, or even the fact that you've applied for asylum, will be shared with your government or anyone in your country. The only people who may have access to information related to your case are people who work for the U.S. government and who have a legitimate need to know this information. Now, the interpreter has already taken an oath to keep everything confidential. They will not share anything they hear today. Since what we discussed today will be kept in confidence, you should feel free to speak openly. I do need you to be open and forthcoming so that I can get all the information I need to make a decision in your case. I ask also that you please use short phrases and pause frequently when speaking today. This will give the interpreter time to render what you've said. Also, it gives me time to type. You'll see and hear me typing throughout today's interview, especially during the questions and answers portion. This is because I've got to keep a record of what we're discussing. I'm taking notes on everything, and it helps me if you speak slowly and pause after every sentence or two. You may see me hold up my hand to indicate that I want you to stop talking, or I may say something like, oh, hold on, or pause. And this is just so I can catch up with my typing. You'll also see me looking at my computer screens while we're talking. I assure you that I'm still paying attention to what you're saying. I do have to type to take notes, and I do have to do some administrative things for your case while we're talking, so it may look like I'm distracted, but I assure you, I'm still listening carefully to what you're saying. At any time today, if you need to go to the restroom or just want to take a break or relax or get a drink of water or anything like that, just let me know. We can do that, no problem. Okay, that's it. That's the gist of the speech that I gave as an asylum officer at the beginning of the interview, and you can expect to hear something more or less along those lines at your interview. Now, either during that little introductory talk or right after it, the officer will ask you to raise your hand and take an oath. They'll ask you to promise, affirm, or swear that you're going to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth during the interview. Then they'll have you sign a form that says basically the same thing and which reminds you that you could be penalized, including prosecuted criminally, meaning you could go to jail, for lying. If you're going to do your interview in English without an interpreter, but you've indicated that English is not your native language, then the officer will ask you to sign a form that says you want to proceed in English without interpretation, even though it's not your native language. In signing this, you're saying that you believe you are fluent enough in English such that you don't need an interpreter. Next, the officer will review with you your asylum application form. This can take a while and it's a bit tedious as they're going to cover almost every single item on the form. The idea with this review is to ensure that everything in your form is correct and up to date. If anything needs to be changed, the officer will handwrite those edits on the form in red ink, assuming that you applied on paper. If you applied online, the proposed edits are made to an online version of your form, which the officer will later show you on a tablet or computer. For some of the items on the form, they'll just read the question or instruction and ask you to answer it. For example, they may say, state your full legal name. But for others, they'll tell you what you wrote and ask you if it's accurate. This is a quicker way to go through the form, but officers are instructed to do this only for certain questions and to make you actually produce the response for certain questions. They may say, you indicated that your phone number is 713-444-4444. Is that still your phone number? Now, this is normally much quicker than what is your phone number, where the applicant has to think about it for a second and may struggle to remember this information, especially under the stress of an interview. You'll recall that most of the questions on the asylum application form, called Form I-589, are biographical in nature. There's lots about your personal history, like places you've lived, worked, and studied, and information about your entries into the United States and about your family, and so on. But there are also a handful of substantive questions, mainly about your fear of returning to your country. The officer will probably not go over the substantive questions during this review of your application. Rather, they address all of that in the next segment of the interview after they're done reviewing the asylum application. The only one of the questions that sometimes requires a narrative response that they will likely ask you about during the review of the asylum application form is the one concerning the 1-year filing deadline. The officer will likely ask you during the review of your application form, did you file your application within 1 year of your arrival in the United States? If you say no, they may ask you questions about it at this time, but they'll likely save those follow-up questions regarding why you didn't file timely for the next phase of the interview. The officer will ask you whether anyone helped you in completing your asylum application, and if you say yes, they'll ask who, and they'll probably ask how they helped you, like what exact support did they provide? Same with the declaration or personal statement that you submitted in support of your application. The officer will likely ask you whether anyone helped you in creating it. They may ask whether you looked at or used any samples, like whether you got ideas for your declaration by looking at one done by someone else. These questions about getting help could come now during the review of the asylum application, or they could come as part of the substantive questions that follow this step in the interview process. As you're well aware, the asylum application form is long, and you've provided a bunch of information in it, much of it related to stuff from a long time ago, which you probably had to look up because you don't remember it. For example, you're supposed to list the address at which your primary school was located. Who knows that off the top of their head? The fact that the officer is going to be reviewing this information with you at your interview prompts the question, do you need to memorize all of this so that you can repeat it back to the officer when asked about it? For example, do you need to know the dates of employment for each job you've had for the last 5 years, along with the address for those jobs? Short answer, if you feel like you've mastered the details concerning the substance of your case, then sure, it can only help to go back and study and memorize all these little details in your asylum application. Knowing these details will help move things along quickly at the interview and keep the officer happy. It's really annoying for them when it takes a long time to get through the asylum application review. And sometimes this can take well over an hour. It's painful. But by far, your priority in preparing for your interview should be familiarizing yourself with all the facts related to your actual claim. This means studying and, yes, even basically memorizing the declaration that you've submitted in support of your case. That's way more important than knowing the details about your personal history that the asylum application calls for. Only after you've mastered your declaration should you spend any time trying to memorize the biographical details in your asylum application. Okay, note that there are almost always changes or updates that are done during this review. I've rarely seen an application form that didn't need to be corrected or updated. It's totally normal, so don't feel like it's a problem if you end up with lots of proposed edits to your application form. Once the officer has finished reviewing the form with you, they will ask you to sign the application, indicating that with the changes, everything on the form is now correct and up to date. Before you sign, You'll go through and look at all the proposed changes, which should be numbered, making it easier to keep track of them. Do look at them carefully. If you notice anything that's incorrect, bring it to the officer's attention. Note that sometimes, rather than signing now, right after the review of the form, the officer will have you wait to sign your application form until the very end of the interview. If, at the end of the review of your application, you feel at all like you need to take a break for any reason, this is a good time to ask for one. It's a natural transition point. Also, you're about to enter the tough part of the interview where you're really going to be tested. You want to enter it feeling focused, and taking a quick break now may help to do that. All right. So that brings us to phase 3 in the asylum interview process, which is the heart of the interview. It's the question and answer portion, where the officer is asking you substantive questions to gather information that they will use to determine whether you're eligible for asylum. Usually, to start this off, the officer will say something like, "Now we're going to talk in detail about your case. Please remember to listen carefully to my questions and try to answer the exact question being asked. As I mentioned earlier, I'll give you a chance at the end of the interview to tell me anything else you want me to know." Basically, what the officer is saying with this is, when I ask a question, give me a direct answer. I don't want to hear about anything that doesn't concern the question I'm asking. Don't go and tell me stuff that you simply want to tell me. Just answer my question, and then I'll ask another, and you'll answer that one. And we'll just keep going on like that until I ask you to tell me about anything you want me to know that we haven't yet discussed. That's the idea here. And let me just repeat something I tell people all the time. You do need to answer the question being asked. Don't go off and try to force into the conversation stuff that the officer isn't asking you about. There's nothing more frustrating for the officer than when an applicant won't answer the question being asked. As I teach in various trainings, you can answer in a way that addresses the question, but which is also calculated to give the officer relevant information that addresses the most important aspects in an asylum case. Okay, so now the officer is going to start with the questions. In the present training, I'm providing an overview of the interview. For examples of the kinds of questions you can expect to be asked, be sure to watch my training, 133 Questions to Expect at Your Asylum Interview, which, despite the name, actually includes way more than 133 sample questions. Very often, before getting into your claim, the officer will ask a few questions like, "How are you feeling today?" And "Is there anything going on, like any health conditions or medications or anything at all that could affect your ability to understand my questions or to answer them today?" They may also ask whether you've ever been diagnosed by a medical professional with any kind of memory problem. Basically, they want you to be on record saying that everything's fine so that you won't have an excuse later of, "Oh, I was groggy from my medication and got confused because of it," or "I just have memory issues. That's why I couldn't remember any of the details you were asking me for." Now, as mentioned, the officer also may ask questions near the beginning of the interview about how you went about completing your asylum application, like whether anyone helped you, and they often ask questions along these lines about the declaration that you submitted in support of your application. Now, next, the officer may jump right into the substance of your case, or they may try to get a better feel for who you are and how sophisticated you are by asking a bit about your life back in your country, like about your education or your job there. Very often, the first or one of the first substantive questions is either, "Why did you flee your country?" or "Why do you fear returning to your country?" What the officer is looking for here is a 1 or 2 sentence summary of your case. Now, I talk more about this and give an example of the type of answer you could give in my training, The CHIPS Framework for Asylum Success. So be sure to check that out if you haven't done so yet. The officer is going to ask you a ton of questions to assess your asylum eligibility with a focus on the CHIPS elements. Now, if you've seen that training, you'll know that the most important things, the things on which the officer is likely to spend the most time during your interview, are persecution, i.e. harm, and nexus, i.e. motive. In short, they really want to know 3 main things. 1, whether you've suffered harm in the past that is severe enough to rise to the level of persecution, as that word is understood in the U.S. asylum context. 2, whether you're likely to suffer harm in the future that is sufficiently severe to rise to the level of persecution. And 3, whether the past persecution and the feared future persecution are motivated by the fact that you possess one of the 5 protected grounds under U.S. asylum rules. In other words, for that last part, is the persecution happening because you possess, or at least the bad guys believe you possess, one of the 5 protected grounds and they don't like that about you? To assess these things, the officer is going to ask you lots of questions about incidents in the past where you've been harmed or threatened, and about any circumstances that indicate that someone may harm you in the future and that indicate why the harm has been or will be inflicted on you, as in, what's motivating the persecution. Some officers are professional and polite in doing this, while some, unfortunately, are not. Some can come across as hostile. You may feel like you're being interrogated. This is tough, but you've just got to try to keep your cool. Don't let them rattle you. You've got a job to do. You're going to answer their question, telling your story in the confidence that you're well prepared, in no small part because you've taken the initiative to do my trainings. Note that the questions surrounding incidents might not proceed in chronological order. The officer might ask you about a recent event, then might jump back to the first incident, then go to some other incident totally out of the order in which they occurred. They do this more than anything to test you. They think that someone who has just made up stuff and memorized it probably memorized it all in chronological order, and that talking about these things outside of that order will be hard or impossible for them. The idea is that if these things really happened, you should be able to talk about them in any order. If you've been harmed multiple times, they might not ask you about every instance of harm, but instead they might use the first, last, worst framework, where they ask you about the first time you were harmed, the last or most recent time, and then also about the one where you were harmed the worst, where the worst things happened to you, assuming it wasn't the first or last incident. If you've not been harmed, then questions will focus on what it is about you and what circumstances more generally will make you a target for harm in the future. Most officers divide this substantive questions portion of the interview into a few segments. Most start with questions about past harm, and then they move on to future harm. What is there to indicate that you'll likely be persecuted in the future? Those two topics, past harm and potential future harm, make for most of the substantive questions. The officer will ask you at least a few questions about a topic called internal relocation. The idea here is that someone doesn't need asylum here in the United States if they could just go back to their country and be safe in some new location there. The officer will ask questions to determine whether you could avoid being harmed in the future by relocating internally in your country. They'll also ask questions about whether doing so would cause undue hardship on you or your family. Like, is there anything about going to some other region where you'd be safe that would be really hard or perhaps dangerous for you or your family? To name just one example, lack of adequate health care for someone who has a serious medical condition would be relevant to this analysis. If you were in any other countries after leaving your country and before arriving in the United States, even if only at the airport for a connecting flight, the officer will ask you about your time there, including what your immigration status was and whether you did or could have applied for permanent status there. This is getting at a concept called firm resettlement, which basically says that you can't get asylum in the United States if, after fleeing your country, you were physically present in another country and had, while you were there, either permanent residence or an offer to get it. Let me touch briefly on credibility confrontations. What is that? Well, a credibility confrontation is something the officer will do when they think that something you've said is not credible. In other words, they do this when they suspect you may be lying about something, or at least they think something you've said or provided for your case doesn't match up with another bit of information or evidence in your case. For example, if you say in your personal statement that 3 people attacked you, but then at your interview you say it was 4 people, well, this is an inconsistency, and the officer is going to confront you over it. So what does this credibility confrontation look like? Well, the officer will say something like, in your statement you said X, but now you're saying Y, and those 2 things don't match. Can you explain why you've provided 2 differing accounts? Or to go back to our example, it would be something like, in your declaration, you said 3 people attacked you, but today, during the interview, you said it was 4 people. Can you help me understand why you provided differing accounts regarding how many people were involved in the attack? You see, the officer has to explain to you what the problem is, the inconsistency or the thing that calls your credibility into question, and They have to give you a chance to explain it, in case there is, in fact, a reasonable explanation that clears things up. You see, if they don't give you a chance to explain it, or if they do give you a chance to explain and you do, in fact, explain it sufficiently, then they cannot use this point against you in making a negative decision. So when you hear an officer phrase a question along the lines of the examples above, you'll know this is a credibility confrontation. So the question is, what should you do? Well, for starters, don't freak out. Stay calm and try to think carefully about the two statements that the officer is saying don't match up. It may in fact be the case that there's a good explanation for this seeming disconnect, and that you'll be able to clear up the misunderstanding by just explaining it to the officer. Also, sometimes these problems are due to the officer misunderstanding or mischaracterizing something you've said. If you think that's the case, then you should say so. For example, you could say, "Oh, I believe I stated it slightly differently. Perhaps there was a miscommunication," and then you can explain more. If you're confident the officer got it wrong, that they're attributing to you something you didn't really say, then you should say this plainly. You should say something like, "I believe you mischaracterized my comment. I believe I said X. I ask that you please record this difference in recollection in your notes." Now that last bit, ensuring that the disagreement with the officer over what gets said in the notes the officer is taking, it may help you when the officer's supervisor goes to review the record. It could also help if you get a negative decision and you want to do a motion to reconsider, which is kind of like an appeal. All right, that's credibility confrontations. Now, how long does this portion of the interview, the substantive questions, last? Well, it can be anywhere from 1 to several hours. I would say that the average is probably about 2 hours, but don't worry if it takes longer. The fact that it may last, say, 3 or 4 hours doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem or that you'll be denied. You do need to understand that the officer will not let you simply explain your story and state your case at your interview. Rather, they will ask you question after question. They will cut you off, redirect the conversation, and ask questions that may seem to have little relevance to your case. I believe that some officers, I'm sorry to tell you, are actually trying to trip you up, trying to get you to commit errors so they'll have an excuse to deny you. Now, this part of the interview, the substantive questions and answers, can be very difficult. Applicants often become emotional, and it can be very hard to properly state your case because of the stressful environment. Even sophisticated, smart people who have what looks to be a really solid case can get tripped up during this question and answer portion of the interview. It happens all too often. But thankfully, there are things you can do to make this go more smoothly, to increase your chances for having a great interview, the kind that will help you win asylum. This training and the others I'm making available to you are an important part of that. Now, the last thing about the substantive questions, I'm often asked whether you can keep notes or other documents out for reference, and unfortunately, the answer is no. The officer won't let you look at documents during the interview. You've got to rely on your memory, which makes preparation all the more important. Okay, one word on the order of events before we head to the next step. Rarely, the officer will do the substantive questions before reviewing the asylum application form. This is pretty rare, but it happens every once in a while. So I just wanted you to know that this could happen so that you're not thrown off if it occurs in your case. Okay, we're almost to the end of the interview. We're at step 4 in the asylum interview process, which is the bar questions. These are questions designed to elicit information that the officer will use to determine whether any bars to asylum apply in your case. You see, certain things in a person's history can make them ineligible for asylum. And when that happens, it's said that a bar to asylum applies. What those bars are is beyond the scope of this training, but just know that there are certain questions along these lines that the officer asks every single asylum applicant. And they may have additional questions for you based on what they know about your history from your application materials, what you've said so far during your interview, and from government records. These questions are mostly security related. They mostly have to do with crimes and terrorist or violent activity. For most people, this part of the interview takes only about 15 minutes or so. These questions may sound kind of bizarre, and you may feel like you're being accused of something terrible. You simply can't take it personally. They have to ask everyone these questions. It's not personal. You do need to listen carefully to every question that's asked. You can't just think, oh, I'm not a bad person, therefore none of this applies to me, and then just answer no to all of these questions. Do take them seriously and listen closely, because the officer may phrase the question in a way that you actually do need to answer yes to. For example, they may ask whether you've ever lied or misrepresented anything to a U.S. immigration officer. And you may think, no, I'm telling the truth about everything that's happened to me, and therefore answer that question with a no. But watch out, because this is kind of a trick question. If you intended to seek asylum in the United States at the time of your visa interview in your country, but you told the visa officer that you just wanted to go to the United States for a short visit, like for tourism or to visit friends or family, then you did, in fact, misrepresent your intentions. It's the same if you said something like this to the Customs and Border Protection official at the airport in the United States if they asked what the purpose of your visit was. If you did this, you should answer this question at your asylum interview with a yes and explain what happened. This kind of misrepresentation will be forgiven. It won't keep you from getting asylum. But lying about it at your interview, or even incorrectly indicating that you haven't ever lied because you simply didn't consider this while trying to respond to the question at your asylum interview, well, yes, that can be more problematic and could even get you denied. Now, you may be asking, if I don't reveal it in my application materials or at my interview, where might the U.S. government get derogatory information about me? What sources does the asylum officer have access to? Well, I can't comment on the specifics of some of the government's sources of information, but I can tell you that relevant information is often found in sources that you've helped create. You may have heard that all prior immigration applications and interviews, including those related to your visa process, are fair game. That's true. Also, social media accounts that are set to be public, to where anyone can access them, can be problematic. You should lock it down before applying for asylum. Police records in the United States may become known to the asylum officer, and yes, in what I think are probably pretty rare cases, criminal incidents in your home country may come to the officer's attention as well. Infrequently, someone who doesn't want another person to get asylum will send a letter to the asylum office saying bad things about the person. This is called a poison pen letter. The officer will probably consider it, but won't give it too much weight. Now, does the U.S. government do an investigation into you on the ground in your own country? Normally, no. Only in the rarest of circumstances is that done. But listen, honesty is the best policy. I encourage you to be 100% honest and open. This is because it's simply the right ethical thing to do, but also there is always a chance that the officer will find out about whatever derogatory information there is about you. Being honest is not just the right thing to do, it's also smart strategically, okay? All right, back to the bar questions at your interview. And this is the last thing on this topic. Your family members who are dependents in your claim will have to answer these questions. Even young children are asked these questions. If the child is too young to understand, a parent will be asked to respond on the child's behalf. Sometimes, to accommodate family members, these bar questions are asked at the beginning of the interview, like either right after the officer introduces themselves or perhaps after they've reviewed the application form with you, but before beginning the substantive questions. Doing the bar questions near the beginning of the interview is much more convenient for dependent family members because once they've answered these questions, they're free to leave. I mean, they can leave the building entirely. Where the bar questions are not asked near the beginning of the interview, but rather at the end, the dependent family members will have to just wait in the waiting room the entire time. And as you know, it can take hours to get to the bar questions. So it's really inconvenient for the family members. Whether to do bar questions up front or near the end of the interview is left up to the asylum officer. If you've got family members included in your case, I hope you'll have a considerate officer who will have the family members come back with you to the interview room from the beginning and will do the bar questions up front, allowing your family to then leave. While we're on the topic of family members, let me address a question I get all the time about their role in the asylum interview. Will they be asked questions about your case? Do they need to be prepared to talk about the facts underlying your asylum claim? The answer, thankfully, is no. While it's possible that the officer may want to ask your family members substantive questions, The chances of that happening are so remote that I really don't think you need to worry about it at all. I don't think it's worth having them study up on your case or otherwise prepare in the ways that you are going to be preparing. They just need to know that they're going to be asked maybe 10 to 20 questions that are mainly security-focused questions. This can be tough to explain to younger kids and should be handled with care. But to be clear, your family members will not be in the office with you while you're answering the substantive questions. This is good because many people don't want their children, or perhaps even their spouse, hearing about traumatic events that they'll be discussing. Okay, we've made it to the last step of the interview. Step 5 of the asylum interview process is where the officer informs you about the possible outcomes in your case and tells you how it is that you're going to receive your decision letter. Sometimes this occurs before the substantive questions as part of the administrative tasks portion of the interview, but more often officers do it at the very end of the interview. They'll explain that if they give you asylum, that's final. You've got asylum. The officer will tell you that you're able to work legally immediately upon receiving your asylum approval notice. They'll probably note that 1 year after the approval date listed on your approval notice, you'll be eligible to apply for lawful permanent residence. Permanent residence is a status a person has if they're what's commonly called a green card holder. So, in other words, you can apply for your green card 1 year after your asylum approval date. As the officer will explain, what happens if they decide you're not eligible for asylum can be a bit more tricky. It depends on your immigration status at the moment when the asylum officer makes their decision. Here's how it works. At the moment, they're ready to make the negative decision, whether that's 2 weeks after your interview or 2 years. Hopefully it won't be that long in your case, but it does sometimes happen. The officer will check to see what your status is. If you do have lawful status at that moment, like if you've still got valid tourist status or perhaps student status or a business-based status, then they will send you what's called a notice of intent to deny. This is a letter that says that USCIS intends to deny your asylum application, and it briefly sets out the reasoning for why they think you're not eligible for asylum. The letter says that you have 16 days to respond to them in writing to try to change their minds. If you don't respond, or if you do, but you don't convince them that they were wrong, which is very hard to do, then they'll look again at what your immigration status is at that moment. If you do still have lawful status, then they send you a denial letter. They deny your asylum application, but nothing else happens. They don't try to deport you, and you just keep on having that other status until it expires. But if you don't have lawful status at the time the government makes a negative decision on your asylum claim, whether that's right after your asylum interview or at the time you respond to a notice of intent to deny, then you don't get an asylum denial, but rather a referral. Your case is referred to immigration court. The officer at your asylum interview may tell you something like, "Oh, that's not a final denial because you'll have another chance to explain your case before an immigration judge." And that's technically true, but don't be fooled. At that stage, you are in deportation proceedings. The government is trying to deport you. You do get to present your case anew before the immigration judge, and you may be able to convince them to give you asylum. The good news is that immigration courts have, at least for the last few years, had higher asylum approval rates than the asylum offices. So all is not lost if your case is sent to immigration court. Now, after explaining these possible outcomes, the officer will tell you whether you need to return to the asylum office to pick up the letter that informs you of your decision, or whether the asylum office will mail it to you. This normally depends on whether you live within a certain distance from the asylum office. If you live really far away, they won't make you come back and pick it up, but instead will mail the decision to you. But there may be times where even people who live near the asylum office are told that they'll receive the decision by mail. This can happen for various reasons, and it's impossible to predict which method will apply in your case. If you have to come back to the office to pick it up, they'll give you an exact date and time that you should be at the asylum office. It's usually 2 weeks after your interview. But when that happens, you may still receive a call a day or two or more before the pickup date telling you that your decision won't be ready on the pickup date and that you don't need to come in and that the asylum office is going to mail the decision to you at some point. This happens pretty frequently. It means they haven't had time to finalize a decision in your case, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem or that you're going to get a negative decision. Finally, at the end of your asylum interview, the officer will ask you to sign a document saying that you understand how you will receive your decision. Then they'll tell you that the interview is over. They or a member of the support staff that they call on will escort you out of the office, through the hall, down into the waiting area. From there, you're free to leave. Just make sure you don't leave anything in the interview room, like a backpack or purse. Also, as mentioned previously, make sure you get back, before heading out, your identity documents and the originals of any other documents that you provided on the day of the interview. Okay, that's it. That's the overview of the asylum interview process. Now you know exactly what you're getting into. The curtain has been lifted and you're not in the dark anymore. And that should provide you with confidence. You're going to do great. Thank you so much for being with me for this training. And again, it's an honor to support you in your asylum journey.